This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder.
When you watch movies or television where therapists are portrayed, how true to form is said portrayal? We put that question to Dennis Palumbo. He's an author of one of my favorite fictional characters in the Dr. Daniel Rinaldi series of thrillers. In addition to being a world-class writer, Dennis is also a psychotherapist, and he specializes in his practice of working with writers and other creative types. He was also the consulting producer on the recent Hulu series The Patient, which was about a therapist who's held hostage by a serial killer hoping to be cured of his homicidal tendencies. Dennis joins us via Skype from California. Hi, Dennis.
Hey, Peter. How you doing?
Just tickety-boo. Thanks very much for being on the program with us once again.
My pleasure.
I wanted to talk about the therapy in films and television. I'm assuming, just like most professions, that when you see your profession depicted on film and screen, it's usually nowhere near accurate. I'll give you an example in my profession. People often ask me if you see radio or television people portrayed correctly in television, and my theory has always been WKRP is not a comedy. It's a documentary. That's how accurate it is. But nothing else comes close.
Wow, that's pretty funny.
That's accurate. How do you feel about when you see therapists portrayed on the screen?
Well, with rare exceptions, therapists are not portrayed as accurately as they could be. And there's a reason for that. Because most of the time, unless they're the lead character, their function, particularly like in crime shows or procedural shows, is to just give a bunch of exposition about the mental state of the bad guy. And so there's a tendency for them to just rattle off in a very kind of facile way a diagnostic category for the bad guy. And the viewers kind of know a little bit. So if they go, well, this guy's obviously a sociopath with mixed emotional features, or he's bipolar with mixed psychotic features and obviously had a bad childhood, I always cringe because, number one, they're talking about someone they don't know, that they've never interviewed or, had a treatment session with. Frankly, I have the same feeling when I see therapists and clinicians on news shows like CNN giving diagnoses of some like serial killer that's out there that they've never treated, that they've never met. And so I think I'm glad in one way that at least the profession shows up now, which it didn't used to in crime shows. But with rare exceptions, usually the therapist character is there to provide a kind of one-size-fits-all, very primary colors kind of diagnosis. And that's when then they're good guy. The other thing about clinicians, at least in my experience, is therapists apparently make great bad guys, because it's one of those professions now where they're often portrayed as sexual predators or psycho killers or whatever. I mean, God, on Law and Order, every other killer on that show is a psychiatrist. So I think because it's a scary profession to a lot of people, the idea of someone who is working in the mental health field and can disclose or understand your deepest secrets, it makes it quite scary. I think one of the reasons Hannibal Lecter is such a powerful character is not because he's a cannibal, but because he's an evil psychiatrist. And I think that that's kind of become a staple. So between being portrayed as supervillain or, when we're the good guys, portrayed as someone who can instantly diagnose someone correctly, to me, it's just weak storytelling. It's an easy way for the writer to kind of describe who the bad guy is so we can get back to the trying to catch him.
Well, you, as I mentioned, were the consulting producer on the recent Hulu series, The Patient. How did that come to be in the first place? And once it came to be, how did you make sure, or how did you give your input to make sure that the therapist involved was depicted correctly, or at least as close to correct as one can in a fictional setting?
Well, yeah, it came about because Joe Weisberg and Joel Fields, the people behind The Americans, which was a very successful TV series, called me out of the blue and said, we're doing this show about a therapist who is kidnapped and held hostage by a serial killer who hopes, because he read the therapist's book, that this guy's going to be able to cure him of being a serial killer. So I signed on as a consultant, and my job was to discuss with them and read all the scripts that came in to make how the therapist reacted as accurate as possible, given how bizarre the situation was. And I think, as they stated, the reason they called me, I mean, the town here in LA, there's a lot of therapists. They called me because I'm a writer who writes psychological thrillers whose hero is a psychologist. And so their understanding of my role was that I would be both a therapeutic consultant for them, but also understand the needs of narrative so that we wouldn't have the therapist waxing eloquently for 20 minutes. We had to move the story along. So I think it was the combination of my experience as a clinician for 30 years and my background as a mystery writer and TV and film writer in my past that made them feel like I was a good choice to consult on the series. And we really tried to make Dr. Strauss, the psychologist portrayed by Steve Carell, his responses, his interpretations, his therapeutic suggestions as real as possible, given how bizarre the situation was.
Well, I was about to ask, because can they be a real interpretation of what he should say when in reality his life is in danger and there is a threat to his life? There are certain flight or fright situations that one has to take into account, even as a therapist.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that we tried to make clear is that he was scrambling to come up with things because at any moment this guy could kill him. And so he's sort of torn between what he thinks is his clinical duty once he's kind of there, and the part of him that every time the kid was gone, he was trying to figure out a way to get out of there. He was both a prisoner and this serial killer's therapist, and trying to walk that line was very, very difficult. Because he had as the therapist, a certain amount of intellectual curiosity about what made this guy tick. But at the same time, he's also knowing that he's playing for time, that if he doesn't keep coming up with suggestions and interpretations that mollify this extremely unstable person, he could be the next victim. So it was a real tight, high wire act to walk for the character and also for us trying to craft the story.
When you got the script as a consulting producer, when you got a look at the script, was there anything that you saw there that you immediately said, oh, a red pencil's got to go through that?
Oh, there were a lot.
What was the biggest culprit?
Well, there was one. The first one was that I think they had him acting as a therapist too quickly. I think he should have been a frightened hostage victim first. So I kind of pulled back on the therapeutic intervention for the first couple scripts because there were 8 in all. The biggest thing is they needed to understand about how the terror soft rule works. And what that rule is if someone says to you, oh, I murdered 3 people, you still have to maintain confidentiality. You can't call the police. You can't say, oh, my patient just murdered 3 people. The Tarasoff law says if they say, I'm going to murder my next door neighbor tonight, then you are legally obligated to call the police. And so the therapist is not obligated to confide in the police or anyone else that the person in his practice is a serial killer. Now, that is in court, that's called privilege. And if a therapist is called to the stand to testify, a judge can revoke that privilege. And then you do have to share the material you talked about in therapy. The only exception to this is, as a clinician, you're court appointed to be a child protector. So if someone comes in and says, oh, I've been abusing my 8-year-old cousin for years, you instantly have to call Child Protective Services. So there's a difference between Terrasoft, where an adult says, I'm going to go kill somebody, or I'm going to drive my car through their window, or any violent act like that. You have to call the police and warn them. But if it's anything they have done in the past, you try to persuade them to turn themselves into the police. But unless it's court ordered, you have to maintain that confidentiality. These are things that these guys didn't know. And one of the things that made me laugh, they said, well, if our therapist gets away, you mean he can't tell the cops anything? I said, of course he can tell them, because he was also a kidnapping victim. As a kidnapping victim, his name is his assailant. You know, he wasn't just the guy's therapist. He was a therapist under duress. And so if he did get away, he would call the cops, because this guy's an active serial killer. He intended to keep killing.
Well, congratulations on being a consulting producer. And that brings me to your famous character, Dr. Daniel Rinaldi. How many novels so far? Is it 6, I believe?
That's right. There are 6 novels in the series.
So when do you get to be the producer of a televised version of Dr. Daniel Rinaldi?
Well, as my mother used to say, your mouth to God's ears. We are certainly going to make the rounds and try to sell that puppy. But I'll tell you what, if it gets picked up as a TV series, you'll be the first to know.
Looking forward to it. Dennis, thank you very much for taking the time once again to be on the program with us. It's always fascinating to talk about your work, and in this case, both sides of your work, and the fact that you can blend together not only your past career as a screenwriter, but also your current career as a therapist. It's amazing how you can blend those two together.
I feel very fortunate that I get to do that. I really do. I think mostly it's a function of just how darn old I am. You know, you have room for a lot of careers when you're my age.
Yeah. Thank you very much for being on the program with us once again, Dennis.
Thank you, Peter. It's my pleasure.
Dennis Palumbo, a psychotherapist who is also a screenwriter and novelist. His thriller series contains 6 Dr. Daniel Rinaldi novels, with the latest one called Panic Attack. He was also the co-writer of one of my favorite films, My Favorite Year, starring Peter O'Toole. Plus, he was a writer back in the day on the sitcom Welcome Back, Kotter. And by the way, if you think I came up with the idea of discussing the depiction of therapists in film all by myself, that answer would be no. It just so happens that Dennis himself wrote a short essay for Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine that was all about this topic. It was entitled, Your Shrinks Might Need to Be Shrunk. You can go to my website at thestufffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0713, and you'll find the links to Dennis's site, plus links to the essay I just mentioned, and also links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order all of his great thrillers, like the latest one, Panic Attack.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestufffile.com. Stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestufffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.